Welcome, everybody. We've got apparently a timely topic of interest here, COVID vaccination and employment. So thank you all for joining us. We've got a jam-packed program, and our panelists today are myself, Mark Mackey, and Kathleen Burney, whose faces I assume you all can see. A couple of administrative notes to begin. We are recording this session, so that recording will be available. And there's a chat feature, as I'm sure everybody's familiar with via Zoom at this point. We're going to try, we have a lot of folks attending, potentially a couple hundred here. And so it may be a little tough to keep up with chats on the fly. So we're going to try and have some time at the end for questions but we do encourage people to use the chat feature to ask questions. If there's a theme of interest, we'll try and address that either along the way or at the end. And if all else fails, we will be following up tomorrow with the written materials from this program, which is the slide deck, a couple of handouts, a nice checklist, client alerts, and we may be able to answer any unanswered questions at that point too. So that's by way of administrative opening. Erin, next slide, please. Okay, this is our legal disclaimer. So the only thing I wanted to focus on this was the last paragraph, which is actually important for this topic. So disclaimer, but the last paragraph notes that, things change quickly and are evolving with the pandemic. And that's true with respect to COVID vaccination as well. So for example, the EEOC is in the midst of proposed regulations about wellness programs and incentivizing the COVID vaccination. A month ago, the EEOC came out with stuff about mandatory vaccination. The CDC has regular updates, the FDA, OSHA may one day get into the act. So there's a lot going on a weekly, if not daily basis here. So there's our caveat. This is a moment in time, this particular webinar. All right, today's agenda. So this is the introduction, and after which my colleague Mark will be talking about the legal landscape. I think we felt it made sense to set the stage by orienting everybody, reminding everybody where we are with the vaccine and what it's all about. And then Kathleen will talk about the law. There's sort of a foundational understanding that needs to be had about COVID vaccination. So, the ADA, the GINA, there's a couple of laws. OSHA has something to say about it, maybe the NLRA. So we'll build sort of the foundation of the legal backstops and requirements when it comes to COVID vaccination. And then the fourth bullet here, the key questions. So that's what we ultimately want to get to. There are a number of questions that many employers are asking. I don't know that they all have hard and fast answers, but we will attempt to address each of these questions. There's about 10 of them we've identified, which we'll walk through in a second. And we've got, as I introduced earlier, 3 panelists, and there's a saying, right? 2 lawyers, 3 opinions. So where does that leave us with 3 panelists? Some exponential number of opinions potentially here. But we will go through these questions at the end, hopefully leaving enough time to get into some depth with them and have a bit of a dialogue. And then last bullet was the Q&A. If we have time for the Q&A, we'll do that. Erin's rushing ahead of me. Okay, now next slide, Erin. All right, introduction. I believe we've covered that. So to jump in, there's a lot going on with mandatory vaccination talk. We're at a point in time that Mark's going to explain where we have an emergency use authorization for 2 well-known vaccines at this point. And, the threshold question, a lot of employers are wondering, should I have a mandatory vaccination program? Well, the slide you're looking at now is just from a couple of days ago, where the CEO for United Airlines came out with a statement to NBC that was to the effect of what you see right in front of you, which is, boy, we think that we should have a mandatory vaccination program. We think other people should do it too. This is Scott Kirby. And one of the things he said, kind of compellingly, it almost sounded like a military reference, was he goes, one of the hardest things I had to do in my career is write these letters to surviving family members of employees who've passed away from COVID, because I think that's going to be the toughest thing that I have to do in my career. I'm getting a chat message that the audio is not great. I don't know if that's an individual concern or if that's widespread, but if anybody has problems with the audio, weigh in. Oh, okay. Sounds like the audio is actually fine. All right, so that was by way of opening, saying, wow, this is a timely topic. Even big companies like United Airlines are weighing in and talking about whether or not mandatory vaccination is a good idea. As we'll discuss, I think the weight of other companies is the other direction, which is what makes United's statement newsworthy. But but boy, it's happening in real time now. People are thinking about these things. Next slide. And the state legislatures are getting into the act as well. So this is about a month old at this point, but that's going to become a factor in this vaccination process as we move forward. States are going to potentially have something to say about it, and we've already seen a bill introduced in New York to this effect, of this headline you see here. Basically, if this bill were to pass, it empowers the local Department of Public Health to require vaccination of citizens. The idea is that if enough citizens don't voluntarily take the vaccine, well, it's a health risk for all of us. So potentially, says the New York legislature, and therefore the Department of Health could mandate vaccine for everybody. So we might see, state legislatures weighing in, and perhaps the other direction too. This is New York. We all know how New York, where New York stands politically, and there's obviously a spectrum and a different way of looking at things. And so who knows what we'll see on the state legislature side as this progresses. So this is all by way of introduction. I want to turn it over to Mark in a second, but first let me just frame some of the questions we're going to be hoping to ultimately get at here for you all. So here in a COVID-esque sort of format are 5 of the 10 questions we're going to try and answer. One, the big one, right? Can we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? Can we, right, legally? Number 2, should we? Should we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? There's a lot to talk about there. 3, well, should we require reasons for an employee declining vaccination? Should we require that if an employee doesn't want to be vaccinated, fine, but there better be a reason, religious, medical. 4, well, what's the paper trail look like? What paperwork should we use to document, maybe most relevantly, exceptions to our vaccination policy, whether it's just encouraging or requiring vaccination? What's the paper trail look like? And number 5, should we be considering waivers, releases? And that's kind of got subparts, right? Waivers from whom? Releases from what? From the effects of the vaccination? From, the effects of not getting vaccinated and the liability there? So those are some questions. Next slide. And if we are really on our game and can get to everything, we've got 5 more. So number 6, is it okay to offer a financial incentive for employees to get vaccinated? There's a lot of talk about that. All right, Aaron, there we go. Thank you. Number 7, is it okay to assign unvaccinated employees to different duties than vaccinated employees? You could picture that coming up in a healthcare environment, a human services environment, or any environment where people are going into customers' homes, for example. Maybe there's different duties that an employer feels compelled to delegate based on vaccination. Is that okay? Number 8, and well, what if we do allow unvaccinated employees to continue working? Is there liability there? Maybe to coworkers, maybe to customers? How does that work? Number 9, and whatever our vaccination program is, mandatory, voluntary, what are the legal obligations we have? There's going to be information collected about vaccination. So how do we deal with that? What does the law say? And then last one, I can't say we've got a lot of questions on this last one, but a few. And so we put it up there to make it a nice round 10. You can't have a top 9 list. You got to have a top 10 list. And this one is, hey, is there any way to help our employees get to the front of the line? Or are there issues with respect to the line? There's phases in Massachusetts for who gets the vaccine. And so there's a queue, there's a line. And what power does the employer have, if anything, to sort of exercise some input into their employees' placement of the line? So somebody just asked if we can get a copy of the slides. Yes, so we are going to be handing out, distributing tomorrow, the slide deck, some other handouts, a nice checklist, and client alerts that kind of go along with this presentation, and maybe some answers to unanswered questions that we can't get to today. So that will be distributed to attendees tomorrow. And with that, next slide, we have a polling question. All right, this is the interactive part of the program. So let's see if this works. So the question is, and by the way, we have 220 people on the call. If everybody can probably see the participant number there, but 220 folks is a lot. And so this is some telling data we might get here from our group. And we'll start with this one. We got a number of polling questions along the way, but what percentage of your workforce do you think would voluntarily take the COVID vaccine? So if everybody could take a moment to answer this, it'll be interesting to see what people have to say. All right, so that's our results. Hopefully everybody can see the results. And that's what I would have expected, actually. I don't know about you and Mark, Kathleen, in that 50 to 75% range. And to the extent we have clients that are telling us their numbers, they tend to have been in that range. Even in healthcare and human services and frontline responders, you're not really getting more than 75% in the anecdotal experience that I have, and in some cases a little lower, but it tends to be in that 50 to 75% range from my anecdotal experience. So that doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on observations on that. I think that's interesting to get such a big group of people weighing in on that. So anyway, with that, we will move on to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk about the landscape of the COVID vaccine.
Thanks, Pete. So I'm going to go over where we are with the vaccine and distribution at this point. Currently, if we can go to the next slide. Currently, there are 2 COVID-19 vaccines in the US that has received what is called emergency use authorization. As you can see up here in the slide, emergency use authorization, or EUA, is a mechanism to facilitate the availability and use of medical countermeasures, including vaccines, during public health emergencies, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these vaccines that have received emergency use authorization have not yet received full FDA approval, which can take up to several years for a vaccine to receive. See, when there's a public health emergency, such as this COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA may grant EUA to a product based on the best available evidence without waiting for all the evidence that would be needed for full FDA approval or clearance. Now, that's not to say that the FDA hands out this emergency use authorization to any vaccine that gets developed. As you may recall, it took some time after the development of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines before they actually received this authorization. These vaccines that receive emergency use authorization must undergo rigorous testing, including clinical trials, which involve tens of thousands of participants and are conducted in accordance with FDA standards. For the FDA to grant emergency use authorization to a vaccine, it must determine, based on clinical trials and testing, that the known and potential benefits of the vaccine outweigh the vaccine's known and potential risks. So, this is all to say that while the vaccines currently out there have not yet received this full FDA approval, they have undergone some serious scrutiny by the FDA to reach the point where they've received this emergency use authorization and are in the process of being distributed. One note about this emergency use authorization versus FDA approval that may come up is that you may see in the fact sheets provided along with each of the vaccines that the person set to receive the vaccine is informed of their option to refuse the vaccine. Under the statute governing EUA, there is a section that allows the Secretary of Health and Human Services to require that individuals be told that they can refuse a product issued under EUA. I bring this up because if you do institute a mandatory vaccination policy, which we're going to discuss a little bit later in the presentation, you may have an employee come back to you and say that they were told by the person administering the vaccine that they can refuse this vaccine. Now, there's limited precedent on the right to refuse language coming out of the EUA statute, and it's possible that it could be a source of litigation, though we don't exactly know at this point in the employment context. What we do know, however, is that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has issued guidance that says employers can institute a mandatory vaccination policy with certain exceptions without violating federal anti-discrimination laws. And Kathleen's going to touch on that a little bit more later in the presentation. because to our knowledge, the EUA right to refuse issue hasn't been addressed by a court in the employment context. There's not really a definitive answer on that issue at this point, but it's something to be aware of. And, you should contact counsel if it does come up. Next slide, please. As mentioned, 2 vaccines have received emergency use authorizations by the FDA, and that's the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. Both vaccines require the administration of 2 doses. The first shot you receive is the prime vaccine dose and is meant to offer some protection against COVID. The second shot is what's been called this booster dose that is supposed to give you optimal protection against the virus. That's the language they use, optimal protection. For Pfizer, the 2 doses are administered 21 days apart, and for Moderna, they're administered 28 days apart. As you can see on the slide, each vaccine has relatively high efficacy rates. Pfizer's efficacy rate is 95%, and Moderna's is at 94.1%. One thing I want to note here is that there's a difference between efficacy rates and effectiveness rates. When talking about an efficacy rate, scientists are looking at how well the vaccine performs under the most ideal conditions. Effectiveness rate, on the other hand, looks at how the vaccine works in the real world. For example, you may hear that the flu vaccine's effectiveness rate is between 40 and 60%, depending on the season. That means that the flu vaccine reduced the risk of flu by 40 to 60% among the overall population during the flu season. For the COVID-19 vaccine, we don't have the data for the effectiveness rate available just yet because we're still early in the processes of getting the vaccine out to the general population. So it's really hard to say for certain how effective the vaccine will be when administered to the general population and under real world circumstances. Though this is something that is being monitored by Moderna, Pfizer, as well as the CDC. And then another interesting piece of information about the vaccines is that each needs to be stored at sub-zero conditions, as you can see on the slides. To put these 2 numbers in perspective, the Pfizer vaccine must be stored at temperatures colder than winter in Antarctica, whereas the Moderna vaccine storage temperature is similar to that of a regular freezer. Now, in addition to these 2 vaccines that have already received emergency use authorization, Johnson & Johnson, as well as AstraZeneca, are in the process of seeking emergency use authorization for their vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is said to be administered in a single dose, so that could introduce an interesting dynamic into the mix with respect to supply and distribution. And the AstraZeneca vaccine has already received approval for emergency use in other places around the world, including the UK. So we may see some more vaccines hit the market in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's talk about the vaccine rollout. Massachusetts has begun the process of rolling out the COVID-19 vaccine to different populations. As you can see on the slide, Massachusetts' rollout plan is broken into 3 phases. The first phase has already begun and includes groups of people that you may expect: COVID-facing care providers, long-term care facilities, first responders, congregate care settings, home-based healthcare workers, and other healthcare workers. Starting in February and then going through March will be phase 2, which expands the recipients to some other high-risk populations, like individuals 65 and over, teachers, grocery workers, and other workers who interact with the general public on a daily basis. Then phase 3 is set to start in April, and that's when the vaccine is expected to be available to the general population. As far as getting the vaccine distributed, there have been some setbacks and some factors that contribute to the less than warp speed rollout process that I think most people were hoping for. First, as noted earlier, the vaccines that have received emergency use authorization have certain storage requirements that may make it difficult to store mass amounts of the vaccine at distribution sites or transport the vaccine at the sub-zero temperatures required. Second, the administration of the vaccine itself is not a fast process. There's certain information that needs to be provided to recipients and questions asked before the vaccine can be administered. Then the recipient has to remain on site to be monitored for several minutes, and that's to make sure they don't experience any allergic reactions to the vaccine. Additionally, those administering the vaccine need to be trained on how to do so. This means that there aren't always enough people available to actually administer the vaccine. My understanding is that, to address this latter issue, more classes of healthcare providers, as well as certain medical students, are being trained on administering the vaccine. So hopefully that improves the administration process once that's all done. As of January 23rd, there had been more than 41.4 million vaccine doses delivered throughout the US and over 21.1 million doses administered. That means about 51% of the vaccines that have been delivered so far have actually been administered, meaning that, have actually been given to people. The Commonwealth publishes a weekly COVID-19 vaccination report showing that as of January 19th, 2021, 359,919 vaccine doses have been administered in Massachusetts, and that's out of the 591,775 that have been delivered to the state. So, not exactly ideal numbers. I'm sure we'd rather see a lot more of those delivered vaccine doses actually administered. One fact is that the numbers of administered vaccines includes about 50,000 people who have received both doses, meaning that they're fully vaccinated. So that's exciting that we're, in that process of fully vaccinating people. Another concern with the vaccine that's come up is the actual availability of the vaccine as we move into the later phases of the rollout and it reaches the general population. I'm sure many people have seen that Joe Biden has stated that he wants to get 100 million doses administered within his first 100 days. I saw an article on NPR suggesting that Moderna and Pfizer would need to nearly double their deliverables to meet the distribution goals that have been outlined. Now, if Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca receive emergency use authorization for their vaccines, that may ease up the supply concerns, but we're going to have to wait and see on that. And this is all important because the slow distribution and the concerns about availability may actually impact how you go about implementing a vaccination policy. It would be hard to implement and enforce a mandatory vaccination policy if there aren't enough vaccines available for your employees to receive. So, that's just something to keep an eye on and keep in mind when considering what policies to implement. For now, be sure, just make note of what phase you and your employees fall into for receiving the vaccine. And to that end, if we can go to the next slide, we're going to do another poll. So which phase does your workforce fall into? And you're going to get a prompt and it's going to ask you if it's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or if you're unsure. So please lock in those answers now. Okay, so if people can see the results up there, looks like, fairly evenly split with most people falling into the general population, which I think would be expected because, that's going to cover the most amount of people. But, a decent amount of phase 1, good amount of phase 2, and, a lot of phase 3. For those people who are unsure, let's try to connect after the presentation and maybe we can try to figure that out for you. Okay, now moving on to the next slide. Okay, so you've reached the point where you and your employees are eligible for the vaccine. Then what? Well, you need to know where to go to get the vaccine. One option is for employers to administer the vaccine themselves if the state provides the vaccine directly to the employer. Kathleen's going to discuss a few things that employers need to consider before proceeding with administering the vaccine themselves a little later in the presentation. If you're not going to administer the vaccine yourself, you can look to the Massachusetts COVID-19 website for information. Massachusetts has a dedicated section of its COVID-19 website that shows where those who are currently eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine may go to get the vaccine. This is an interactive resource that you may direct your employees to look to when they become eligible for the vaccine. Another option may be to go to a sports stadium for the vaccine. Though I'm sure we would all rather be watching the Patriots this time of the year when we visit Gillette, it has opened up to serve as a mass vaccination site. Fenway Park is also slated to open as a vaccination site beginning February 1. It's expected that at first 300 people may receive the vaccine each day at Gillette, and that number is set to build up to 5,000 per day once more people become eligible. Similarly, for Fenway, the goal is to start with about 500 people per day and double that as the rollout continues. The state's also looking to ramp up vaccinations through pharmacies such as CVS and Walgreens, as well as Wegmans, Big Y, Stop and Shop, and some other pharmacies that you may think of. From what I've read, it sounds like the utilization of pharmacies will be integral in the vaccine rollout as more and more people become eligible for the vaccine. So now that you know the how, the why, and the where about the COVID vaccinations, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Burney to break down some of the legal considerations for COVID-19 vaccinations.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so the law on or with respect to COVID-19 vaccinations. Next slide, Erin, please. We're going to look today at a few different things. We'll start with the United States Supreme Court regarding vaccinations. We're going to look at, spend a good amount of time looking at the EEOC's recent guidance on federal laws and COVID-19 vaccination. And then we're going to touch on some other relevant laws like the PrEP Act, OSHA, perhaps some discussion of workers' comp and union collective bargaining agreements. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start with the United States Supreme Court, which does provide precedent that states can mandate vaccinations under the state's police powers. And this is an old Supreme Court case dating back to 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And in this case, the court was addressing a challenge to smallpox vaccinations. Mr. Jacobson objected that he and his children should be vaccinated. And he objected in addition to the fine that would be instituted of $5 for failing to get the vaccination. He argued that his constitutionally protected liberty interests were infringed by this mandate. And in the end, the United States Supreme Court ruled that state laws mandating vaccinations are lawful under the state's police powers. That's because sometimes our individual interests have to yield to state laws that endeavor to protect the health and safety of everybody. Next slide, please. So the EEOC, which we'll talk some more about, it hits on 3 federal laws generally with regard to COVID-19 vaccinations. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, the Protection for Religion under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and also Title VII with respect to the protection of women against sex discrimination based on pregnancy. And we're going to touch on next the EEOC's guidance with respect to COVID-19 vaccinations. In December, the EEOC issued some technical questions and answers with respect to COVID-19 vaccinations in the workplace. Next slide, please. So before we touch on that, just as a base level, let's talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Generally, in pre-COVID times, ordinarily an employer is prohibited from requiring a medical examination or from making inquiries about whether an employee is an individual with a disability, unless those inquiries or that medical exam are job related and consistent with business necessity For example, many of you during non-COVID times know that when you have a job applicant, you generally can't ask them any questions about their disabilities, nor can you require a medical examination in that application phase of the process. However, the ADA also has a safety qualification standard, and it says that employers may require that they may have this safety standard, and they may require that an individual employee not pose a direct threat to the workplace and to others. They define the direct threat as a significant risk of substantial harm to the health of safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. So in 2020, as you all well know, we entered a new world, unprecedented world. The EEOC had declared that COVID-19 posed a direct threat to the workplace, to workers. And this meant that employers could take steps that were ordinarily prohibited under the ADA. And employers could, in certain circumstances, ask disability-related inquiries, could require what constituted medical examinations. And you are probably all doing this on a regular basis right now with respect to your daily shift COVID screening questionnaires. Some of you might be taking employees' temperatures, which is deemed a medical examination. So again, this time of COVID has provided leeway to employers that they wouldn't have in other circumstances. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in December, the EEOC issued this guidance on COVID-19 vaccinations. And it's interesting, the guidance doesn't expressly state that mandatory vaccinations are lawful, but the EEOC goes on in these question and answers to answer a basic set of questions about vaccinations under this assumption that an employer might adopt a mandatory vaccination policy. And the EEOC is pretty consistently clear in its guidance that although there is leeway for employers potentially to implement these mandatory policies, they won't be permissible under all circumstances. In the guidance, the EEOC focuses on how an employer should respond to requests from employees who cannot or do not wish to obtain a vaccination. And the EEOC states that if safety-based qualification standards, such as vaccinations, require that if they tend to screen out an individual with disabilities, the employer must meet this direct threat standard in order to implement a mandatory vaccination. Now, Mark mentioned, we all recognize we're in this place right now where we don't have enough vaccination on hand to really make it mandatory. But these are some things that I'll talk about that you'll think about as time goes by, and hopefully we're going to find ourselves in a position where there is sufficient supply and some considerations for you to think about. The EEOC is very clear that an employer who is going to mandate vaccinations has to have some kind of program under the ADA to provide exemptions and under Title VII for religious accommodations and medical accommodations to employees that cannot take the vaccination. The EEOC also advises employers what questions they can ask employees about their health, what they can ask about their vaccination history and status, and also advises employers how they can use this information that they obtain vis-a-vis these inquiries. Next slide, please. So we've got another polling question, and we're asking, do you plan to administer vaccines on site? We'll take a minute here. Okay, so it looks like over half of you do not plan on administering on-site, and that's not surprising. Certainly for some of our smaller employers, that will be quite an endeavor, and there are more demands on you with respect to what the EEOC says an employer needs to do if you do administer on-site. So, and it also makes sense that we've got at least 20% of you who aren't yet sure, as this is all very new to all of us. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, the EEOC guidance goes through different elements of what an employer's vaccination program can and cannot do. And it states its position as to which employer actions may implicate the ADA or GINA. For example, the EEOC states that an employer administering the vaccination is not a medical examination under the ADA because the employer is not seeking information about the individual's impairments or current health status. The EEOC also states that the COVID vaccination does not implicate GINA because it doesn't involve the use of genetic information at all. Next slide, please. However, the EEOC states that although the administration of the vaccination itself wouldn't implicate the ADA, that the screening questions that are required prior to administering the vaccine are likely to elicit information about an employee's disability and therefore must be job related and consistent with business necessity. To meet this standard, the EEOC explains an employer would need to have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee who does not answer the pre-screening questions and therefore doesn't receive a vaccination will pose a direct threat to the health and safety of themselves or others in the workplace. On the flip side, however, the EEOC advises that if an employer's vaccination program is voluntary, then the employee's decision to answer or not to answer those questions is also voluntary. Next slide, please. Just as administering the vaccination does not implicate the ADA, nor does an employer requesting merely proof, the certificate that employees have been getting once they get the vaccination. It doesn't provide any information on its face about a disability or confidential medical information. However, it's important that if an employer is asking for this proof of vaccination, that it be just the proof with nothing else attached to it to implicate the ADA. However, another caveat here is that if an employer mandates that an employee provide proof of vaccination, the employee who opts not to get the vaccination because of a medical disability or because of a religious objection, who would have to, if they had to answer why they declined, that would implicate ADA or a religious accommodation request. So under those circumstances, again, pardon me, the ADA standard requires that doing this, the employer must have job-related and business necessity reasons for mandating the proof of the vaccination. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the EEOC guidance makes it clear that an employer who adopts a mandatory vaccination policy has to have a procedure to provide exemptions to the vaccinations or accommodations to the vaccinations absent undue hardship on behalf of the employer. This means that employees with disabilities and employers with religious objections or pregnant employees have a means by which they may be exempted. So this is just like an employer would do right now under normal circumstances. An employer would, as soon as you become aware of an employee's request for accommodation, you're obligated to engage in an interactive dialogue with that employee who's got the objections or needs the accommodation. And this will always be an individualized, fact-specific analysis based on the employee's job, based on the industry, based on the circumstances of your particular employee, company or business. And now I'm going to turn this over to Mark, who's going to talk about religious accommodations to vaccinations.
Thanks, Kathleen. So as Kathleen mentioned, there may be circumstances where an employee requests an exemption from an employer's vaccination policy. One of those instances may be where an employee holds a sincerely held religious belief that prevents the employee from receiving the vaccination. We see this a fair amount when it's flu season and an employee may seek an exemption from the flu vaccination. More times than not, the exemption request is based on a religious belief as opposed to a medical condition. If you receive if you receive a religious exemption request, just as you would with any other accommodation request, you have to engage in an interactive dialogue with the employee and try to assess whether there is a reasonable accommodation for the employee that would allow the employee to continue to perform the essential functions of the job without receiving the vaccine. One area where employers sometimes run into trouble with respect to religious accommodation requests is when they begin to question the employee's religious beliefs. Remember, just because you have not heard of the religion or the specific basis for the exemption does not mean it is not a sincerely held religious belief. Title VII and Massachusetts anti-discrimination law both have broad definitions of what it means to be a sincerely held religious belief. The EEOC guidance on the matter provides that the employer should ordinarily assume that an employee's request for religious accommodation is based on a sincerely held religious belief. If you have an objective basis for questioning the religious nature or sincerity of the belief, you should contact counsel about what to do. Next slide, please. As you can see from this slide here, the religious accommodation question has been litigated a decent amount in the context of flu vaccinations in the medical care setting. The Children's Hospital case up top is particularly interesting as it provides some cover for those in the medical industry who have patient-facing employees who seek an exemption from a vaccination policy. I'll note, however, that the outcome of that case was fact-specific and may not apply in all instances. When dealing with these religious accommodation requests, it's really important to seek advice of counsel, especially if you're considering denying a request. All of us, Kathleen, Pete, and I, we've all have some experience with some interesting accommodation requests. And I'm going to invite Pete to tell us a little bit about any war stories that he may have had.
Yeah, no, thanks. So let me just reframe the issue for a moment, because we've been doing a lot of talking and there's just so much going on here. We're sort of circling around this question of, can you have a mandatory vaccination policy, and what sort of pushback do you have to tolerate and accommodate? So I think it helps to think of it this way. A lot of the law and a lot of what Kathleen was talking about comes from the EEOC, the anti-discrimination laws. I mean, there are other sources of potential law and affecting the analysis of mandatory accommodation, but the EEOC oversees a certain subset of laws, right? The anti-discrimination laws, Title VII, religious discrimination, the ADA, disability discrimination, GINA, genetic information. So the cases that we see, and really where the rubber hits the road, the practical issues that you end up seeing kind of fall into that framework. Like, well, sure, you can have a mandatory vaccination policy, but don't you have to give me an accommodation? So it kind of almost, when you talk about religious accommodations, it's almost assuming that there's this mandatory vaccination policy at issue. But how about the accommodation? How did you handle that right? So for the folks in the chat that are saying, hey, so where do we stand on this mandatory vaccination thing or not? We're getting to that question, but let me just frame it this way. You know, the battlegrounds have, and because of the laws we're dealing with, the anti-discrimination laws, it focuses on the accommodation. And so religion has been a big one. And I would say up to 5 years ago, this is not something we spent a lot of time thinking about. I think in the last 5 years, there have been some very bad flu seasons. I know one year in the United States, there were close to 60,000 flu deaths. And so you really started seeing the healthcare industries, the hospitals, getting more strict about the flu vaccination. And you start seeing some of these cases come up where people have reasons for not wanting to be vaccinated for the flu. So is there a carryover between the flu and COVID? Yeah, to some extent. We'll talk about some of the limitations of that analogy, but a lot of what we know about the sort of, hey, I have a mandatory vaccination policy, does somebody get an exception, comes from recent years involving the flu. And I know Mark and Kathleen and I have learned a lot just talking with clients in the last couple of years, stuff we've never thought about before. And, one of them was somebody believed in a healthcare environment that the flu vaccine contained pork products. And they were Muslim, and they said, well, that would violate a tenet of my religion. I said, huh. So you look into it, and you look into the manufacturing of it and try and determine if that's true or not. And with the flu vaccine, at least, there were alternative vaccinations you could offer. But that's exactly the kind of interactive dialogue the law wants to see you have. In that case, it was about religion. It was the belief that the sincere belief that the vaccine would violate a tenet of one's religion in terms of what gets ingested into the body. Or inserted into the body. Other ones, we had one earlier this year, Mark, where it was really an eye-opener to me. It was as a healthcare provider, a nurse at a hospital that said she had a sincerely held religious belief opposing vaccination because she felt it interfered with God's will. Mm-hmm. So that, I believe it was a sincerely held religious belief. It was based on her Christianity-based faith. But wow, for a healthcare provider to believe that a vaccine interfered with God's will, I sort of shudder to think where medications fall into this healthcare provider's analysis of what interferes with God's will. But even so, I mean, that's the type of religious-based pushback you get. And you can't really question the sincerity of the belief so much. You can sort of verify it, but you can't really question it because you're not supposed to be getting in, and the government is not supposed to be getting into determining which religions are valid and which aren't. But it then becomes, once the sincerity's minor hurdle is crossed, it just becomes about that accommodation. Can you deal with it? Is there a way to accommodate it? Is it reasonable? Is it an undue hardship? So Mark, I know we had a good one too, that we looked into and that you want to talk about, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, there was one other that was interesting that came up this past year where an employee requested an accommodation from the flu vaccine on the basis that they believe that the flu vaccine may have been developed through the use of aborted fetuses as part of their research. And that was an area where, we kind of had to look into this a little bit. We had to see, okay, well, where is this belief coming from? Where that we had to do some background research. And, it turns out that there may be, in some scenarios, some of the vaccines have actually, way back in the day when they were first getting developed, sometimes they did use, research through cell lines from aborted fetuses. So there was, some legitimacy to, what this person was claiming. And, it came up in a news alert for me that I thought was extremely interesting was that, in this context, the Vatican actually has recently come out with a press release saying that it's morally acceptable to receive the COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in their research and production process. And I thought that was interesting because, it shows that, this issue that came up to, with Pete and I in this healthcare setting has actually, come up enough to the point where the Vatican actually had to address it and say, listen, we're not signing off on abortion, obviously, but, you know, if the only vaccine that's available is one that is developed through cell lines from aborted fetuses, you know, this is such a crisis that it's okay for you to get that vaccine. It won't be morally wrong for you to get that vaccine. So, you know, that was just another interesting case, you know. And I think we got a question about asking about the religious belief. You know, I think it depends the context and, you know, what they're asking for is an accommodation. You know, what Pete and I were talking about, it generally came up in healthcare settings. And we may be talking about this a little later on, but I think, you know, what we generally ask is for, you know, just the person to identify why they're asking for an exemption, you know, what the, you know, just articulate basically what the belief is, or, you know, what the reason for the exemption is. You know, you're not putting them through hurdles. You're not, you know, you're not following up too much and questioning what they're asking, you know, what their religious belief is. But, you know, you can ask the question and see if it, you know, it actually is religious based. If somebody just says, I want an exemption from the vaccine because of my religion, you know, that in and of itself doesn't really give you the picture of whether or not they're actually entitled to an accommodation for their religious beliefs. You know, you can ask, okay, well, you know, what's the basis for this exemption request? And that's probably about, you know, in most cases, that's probably about where you want to stop. I think Pete may have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I kind of want to just jump in and talk about sort of the trend, and it's good, you know, that we were seeing in the past few years, and it'll be interesting to see where COVID falls into this previous flu trend. So if you look at the slide, you can see these cases, and there's this report about an EEOC settlement. They're all in the last couple of years, and my sense is that for a long time, and this battleground's typically been in hospitals and healthcare settings, and mandatory vaccination had been resisted by the nurses union in New York and in Massachusetts. And that battle sort of intensified as hospitals sort of intensified their efforts to require mandatory vaccination. They were no longer just letting people decline for the sake of declining. They were pushing back and requiring a real medical or religious basis. And I think that battle was largely lost by the unions a couple of years ago around here. You can see that Children's Hospital case, the first one. So the M&A has sort of, in my view, sort of licked its wounds and sort of retreated on this retreated on this opposition to mandatory flu vaccines. And the courts really, in the wake of some serious flu seasons, had seemed to be siding with the healthcare providers, saying this is serious stuff. You know, it's an undue hardship to give exceptions to this stuff. And so there was that one trend line going. And the other thing that was happening, which is now affected by the pandemic, is whenever in the past somebody wanted a accommodation to a mandatory, say, flu vaccination policy, they could get it if it was legitimate and it was able to be awarded. But there was always the alternative. You'd have to wear the mask, right? So it wasn't always going to be the frontline healthcare worker, but the person who works in IT in the hospital, who nonetheless has contact with patients and walks through patient care areas and things like that. If that person, you could say, well, we can accommodate you somehow, but you're always going to have to wear the mask in patient care areas. I always thought that used to be sort of a scarlet letter, you know, up until not long ago, i.e. a little more than a year ago, that was unusual to be wearing a mask around your workplace. And anybody in a healthcare setting who was wearing a mask like that, you know, there's a good chance they were a flu vaccination objector. It was a little bit of a scarlet letter. So I thought there was some, you know, almost disincentive built in, and it really kept people honest in their objections. So now what we're seeing is people objecting to the you know, flu vaccinate, COVID vaccine might be like, why would I need the vaccine? Just let me keep wearing the mask. Just let me keep social distancing. Everything's fine. You know, everybody's already wearing the masks. The alternative accommodation is already so widespread that people are prone to say, well, it's easy to accommodate me. You know, well, why can't I just keep doing this? So the mask wearing and the alternative sort of safety measures, you know, might make the COVID situation very different from the flu vaccination situation. And there's also one other very big difference. I don't know if we talked about it yet. I think Mark did in the emergency use stuff, but these cases, the flu vaccination stuff, the old OSHA guidance on this stuff, when you're talking about flu vaccinations, those were not emergency use authorizations. Those have full FDA approval. And there's a difference. And certainly in people's minds, there may be a difference that this is somehow an experimental phase, you know? So that will play into mandatory vaccination potentially in a way that we haven't seen yet with flu vaccination cases that kind of are our main analogy. So we, plenty to talk about here. I just wanted to sort of mention that. The other thing too is somebody mentioned in one of the chats that there's an anti-vaxxer, we all know the term. And the question is, where does the line of anti-vaxxing turn into religion? And so we addressed that generally. Let me just say something a little more specific about it. Technically, one's personal beliefs about not wanting to have a vaccination in their body because of distrust or what have you is not a religious belief, but it's far closer than you'd think. And it's a short step to turning it into a sincerely held religious belief. And I think some courts have even been a little more accommodating than others, recognizing religions like veganism or something. Is that a religion? Well, I don't know. It's really sincerely held belief. So you do see that a lot with flu declination requests, exemption requests, something that really sounds anti-vaxxer, but is being couched in religious terms. It's tricky to push back too hard on that. I mean, if somebody's purely expressing a personal preference, expressing a political view, that's not a religion. But boy, it has to be pretty clear because it's a short step to sort of turn that into a protected religious belief. And that's what we see people sometimes doing. Like they know better. They know how to frame their beliefs in terms of the divine requirement to keep their body pure or something. It's not a big step. So I just wanted to mention those few things. And as we're talking about this real interesting area, the religious accommodation requests.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, no, that was extremely helpful. And I saw somebody ask in the chat about whether or not they're going to be able to get this presentation afterwards. Just a reminder, we are going to send out the slide deck afterwards, and any of the common questions that we've received in the chat, we're going to try to we'll see if we can answer those in the follow-up email as well. So if we can move on to the next slide. So now let's just go over, there are a few other legal considerations outside of the discrimination context to be aware of when talking vaccination programs. The first is the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The agency charged with carrying out this act, often referred to as OSHA, has not spoken directly on whether mandatory COVID-19 vaccination programs are permissible under the act, under Occupational Safety and Health Act. However, in response to the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, which I'm sure we all remember, the swine flu pandemic, OSHA issued an interpretation letter that provided that it was permissible for employers to mandate that employees receive the H1N1 vaccine before entering the workplace. Based on this guidance, one could surmise that OSHA would take a similar position with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine. Another piece of OSHA to be aware of is what is often referred to as the General Duty Clause, which requires employers to provide a place of employment free from recognized hazards likely to cause death or serious physical harm. In that same interpretation letter regarding the H1N1 vaccine, OSHA recognized that there may be scenarios where an employee refuses vaccination because of a reasonable belief that the employee has a medical condition that creates a real danger of serious illness or death if the employee were to receive the vaccine. If that's the case, the employee may be protected from adverse action under OSHA if they refuse the vaccine. I would note, though, that if you are faced with this latter situation, it's likely that you're already going to be in the ADA territory and engaging in an interactive dialogue with the employee to find a reasonable accommodation. That is, if they have a medical condition that prevents them from getting the vaccine, they're probably going to be requesting, an accommodation in the first place. Next, we have the National Labor Relations Act, which many people think of in the context of union environments, but actually applies to all employers. For employers with a unionized workforce, you should be aware that you may have bargaining obligations associated with the vaccination policies. So check your contract to see what obligations may exist. All employers, though, whether unionized or not, should be aware that Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act protects an employee's right to engage in protected concerted activity. And it's unlawful to take adverse action against employees for engaging in such activity. So when we're talking about COVID vaccines, if employees collectively band together and protest or hand out pamphlets objecting to a mandatory vaccination program, you likely can't take an adverse action against those employees for engaging in the protest or for handing out the pamphlets. That's not to say that you can't still enforce a mandatory vaccination program policy with the caveats that we've discussed throughout this presentation, but you can't penalize the employee for objecting to the program with fellow employees and announcing their objection. If you're faced with that situation, contact counsel before taking any action. One other federal law to be aware of is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, or the PrEP Act, which provides immunity from liability except for willful misconduct for claims of loss caused, arising out of, or resulting from the administration or use of countermeasures, such as the COVID-19 vaccine. And that protection extends to entities and individuals involved in the development, manufacture, testing, distribution, and administration of such countermeasures. So this may be important because it could be a source of protection from liability if an employee receives the vaccination pursuant to a mandatory vaccination policy and thereafter experiences side effects that cause them harm. And last thing, just keep in mind that there may be state laws coming out regarding the administration of the COVID vaccine. We haven't seen it so far here in Massachusetts, but in New York, for example, there's been legislation, as Pete discussed earlier, introduced that could empower the Department of Public Health to mandate vaccinations if not enough people voluntarily receive it. So just another law to be aware, area of law to be aware of. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pete to address some of those questions that were posed at the beginning of the presentation.
All right. So if you remember where we started, I said we got sort of the top 10 list of questions that we were going to circle back to. But first we wanted to talk about where we are with the vaccine, which Mark did, and where the law, the foundation of the law sort of fits into this, which Kathleen and Mark did. Now let's see if we can actually answer these questions. We'll do this in a little bit of panel format. I'll lead the discussion, but I invite Mark and Kathleen obviously to weigh in. And so again, we'll get that phenomenon of 2 lawyers, 3 opinions, 3 lawyers, who knows how many opinions. But here we go. All right, next slide, Aaron. All right, the big one. Can we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? Okay, so I don't believe there's a unified answer out there. I will say this, that that most employment lawyers that you talk to would say, yeah, you can, but but they're kind of basing that on the EEOC's tacit approval that Kathleen talked about, which is big. I mean, when the EEOC, a government agency charged with enforcing the anti-discrimination laws, comes out and says, maybe grudgingly, but yeah, you can do it, just be careful, which is kind of what they said. You got to look at the accommodation request and you got to keep the information confidential. And if you're asking pre-screening questions, you got to be a reason for that, but otherwise, fine. That was kind of the EEOC's perspective, and that's big. But they're not the only agency out there. OSHA said it was okay to have mandatory vaccination back in the H1N1 flu days. But that was when it was a full approval by the FDA situation, not an emergency use authorization. So if there's pause to be had on giving this a yes answer, I think, and Mark and Kathleen feel free to weigh in, it comes in on the emergency use authorization piece. If you drill down, and the EEOC actually mentions this in their guidance, the one that says you can have mandatory vaccinations, they still mention that, when you have an emergency use authorization approval from the FDA, it's supposed to be voluntary. And if you look at the fact sheets put out by Pfizer, put out by Moderna, right there in the fact sheet, it says, I understand, says the recipient, that this is voluntary and I can decline. So that's an interesting fit, right? We've got the emergency use authorization and the agency that gives that authorization, the FDA, being required to keep this voluntary. Now, I'm sure that the intent of that was so that, it is emergency use. It's kind of a special thing. There's going to be a lack of trust. It's a little bit of a test run here. We're not going to have your health insurance be affected by your refusal. That would be unfair. We're not going to have the government force you to take this vaccination program that's really only an emergency use authorized program. It doesn't really say that private employers can't make it mandatory, but there is a bit of a disconnect there. And depending on who you talk to, you could imagine litigation on that point. I mean, picture being an employee who's got a strongly held belief. Maybe it's not a religious belief, or maybe it would just be an undue hardship to let the employee off the hook and not get vaccinated. That employee says, what are you talking about? it's supposed to be voluntary. The law says it's supposed to be voluntary. The emergency use authorization framework says it's voluntary. The fact sheet given to me by Moderna or Pfizer says it's voluntary. But you, employer, decided it was mandatory? I could imagine litigation on that. So
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
there's no answer to that. Yeah. I mean, go ahead, Mark.
I mean, I think Pete hit the nail on the head. I mean, yeah, the EOC, and first of all, the EOC is guidance. It's not law. It's not a regulation. It's guidance. Though, we've seen how the courts interpret guidance from the agency administering it. They give it they give it deference. But, this is a caveat with a lot of the stuff that we talk about. I mean, just because you may be able to do something, or the law says you may be able to do something, doesn't mean you're not going to face litigation, right? And I think what Pete was talking about, and what we discussed earlier about that EUA component, I wouldn't be surprised if we do see at some point some litigation where an employee subject to a mandatory vaccination policy gets fired because they're refusing to do it, doesn't have a religious accommodation, doesn't have a medical accommodation reason for it, but they just object to it and they file a wrongful termination lawsuit. And that EUA piece could come into that analysis from the court. We haven't seen it yet. We don't know how that'll play out. But I wouldn't be surprised if that comes into play.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to the EEOC piece of this, I like to look at this in two sort of very contrasting scenarios. For a healthcare employer, a mandatory vaccination policy is very different than a mandatory vaccination policy for a high-tech, mostly virtual, right, tech company with people spread across the country. Because the bottom line is that the EEOC says, yes, you may have this mandatory policy, but there are all of these caveats. And the big picture is that it needs to be, an employer will need to justify that it's business related, job related, and consistent with business necessity if they're going to screen out employees from the workplace because they're not vaccinated. So those are the questions, and we have a good checklist that you're going to get tomorrow when we send you the materials. And there are a whole host of other considerations besides just, the law is the basement, right? Like, what are lots of questions for you as a business to think about? Cultural implications. What are your competitors doing out there in the world? What's the cost of implementing a vaccine program mandatorily versus not doing it? A whole number of questions that you're going to need to look at. So, yeah.
And the last point on this, I know this is the big question, but we do have to move on, was, eventually there'll be full approval from the FDA, presumably, for these vaccinations and others. And so that might eliminate the interesting emergency use authorization voluntary question. But just like with at-will employment, it will be the exceptions that matter. So we still get clients that call up and say, hey, it's an at-will employee, I can just fire them, right? Well, technically, yes, but the exceptions to at-will employment are what drive all the litigation, drive the ship. And so that'll be the same with the mandatory vaccination policy. Even when these vaccines get full approval, the battleground, if there's going to be one, will be on the accommodation requests, on the religious requests. Should you have accommodated in a different way, all that kind of stuff. So even if the answer to this question is a resounding yes, which I don't think it's a resounding yes yet, but it's sort of the needle is tipped toward yes. But when it becomes maybe a more resounding yes with full FDA approval, there's still all the caveats and exceptions that become the risk factors for litigation. All right, so we got to move on. There's a lot to say about that, but how about question number 2? Yeah, I guess we could do a poll question. We have till 9:30. I'm hoping we got 20 minutes though. We're on track. All right. So poll question for the group: do you plan on implementing a mandatory vaccination policy? This will be interesting. Okay, so about 50% said no, very few said yes. And there was a lot of maybes. And I suppose a more nuanced question would say, when, if you do plan on implementing a mandatory vaccination policy, would you anticipate doing it now or with full approval? But that I think is consistent with what we're seeing, maybe even a little more aggressive. I think most of the clients that we talk to are not at the current moment rolling out a mandatory vaccination policy. And it's in part based on the emergency use, so that's maybe an excuse. But yeah, it's the real minority of the exception that are considering doing it. They've got their reasons for doing it, consistent with their type of work and their culture and all that. But that's interesting. I appreciate everybody participating in that response. Next slide. Okay, so the first question was, can we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? Sort of a qualified yes. Should we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? And wow, that gets at the question we just asked. Lots to think about there. The one thing I will say is that I was talking to a CHRO, Chief Human Resource Officer at a hospital the other day, and she was very pleased that her hospital had over 75% uptake rate on the vaccination, which, you know, as we know from the last poll question too, is actually a lot and better than many. And she was convinced, she says that it's because it wasn't mandatory. If we had made it mandatory, I would have had less of an uptake on it. There would have been more resistance to it, including from the union, but just from the suspicion aspect and all that. So I think some employers are taking the view that, hey, we shouldn't implement a mandatory vaccination policy at this stage, regardless of legality, just because that's not the way to go. It's got to be more of a communication thing. It's got to be a little bit more of a sales job to it. There's such distrust out there. It's so wrapped up in the politics. Let's go about this a different way. So I think that is helping tip the scales. I think other employers are looking at the emergency use and saying, well, that's a good excuse. I'm not going to do it now. I don't have to worry about it. None of my competitors are doing it. I've heard employers, even I was surprised talking to one employer in a long-term nursing home, a healthcare, long-term care facility. And he was saying, the executive director is saying, listen, if I make it mandatory, I'm going to lose 25% of my workforce and they're going to go right down the street to the competition. I'm just doing my competition a favor. You know, there's a demand for CNAs out there. If I make it mandatory, I'm losing a quarter of my workforce. I can't afford to do that. And I think hospitals are thinking the same thing. They will lose a certain segment of their workforce as people feel strongly about this. And nurses, for example, can go work anywhere. CNAs is a high demand for, lower paid direct care workers in human services. So the question of should we implement a mandatory vaccination policy has not just the law wrapped up in it, but a lot of practicalities in it. And I do think it's interesting that I'm hearing employers say, hey, encouraging is actually the way to go if you're trying to maximize the uptake on it. Yeah, anybody else got anything else to say on the should question?
Just look at it, it's a case-by-case basis, whether or not you should implement the policy. It's going to depend on so many factors, you know, your workforce, the people, the customers or the clients that you're serving, you know, whether accommodations are going to be, you know, possible. If you have a bunch of employees working remote, I mean, there's going to be a question of whether or not you actually need a mandatory vaccination policy. It really, there's so many variables that go into it that I think it's going to really depend on your personal workforce or your personal industry and circumstances.
In the chat, someone asked whether a customer, whether employers' customers would, you know, be permitted to know the percentage of employees who had gotten the vaccination. And that's just another consideration for your business. What's your brand? What's your culture? What's your reputation? What are your competitors doing? And what are your customers going to think about that?
Yeah, United Airlines, right? I'm sure there's a customer-facing element to that. I mean, Scott Kirby framed it in terms of the morally right thing to do for the health of his employees, but I'm sure there's a value in being able to say all of our employees, everybody you fly with on United has taken the vaccination. Wow, that's powerful stuff because people are afraid of flying to some extent. So there's definitely that customer PR end of it too to think about. All right, next question. Should we require a reason for employees declining vaccination? So this gets at the mandatory voluntary distinction. I think if you're having a truly voluntary policy, I've seen both. I mean, it feels a little weird to me. Like, hey, the policy is voluntary, but why aren't you doing it? You know, like if you have a reason, check the box. Is it religious? Is it medical? Or is it just declination? Like those are the three options I've seen. Like, right, it's like, hey, it's either a religious objection, it's a medical objection, or I'm just declining. I never really love that, because if it's voluntary, I could see more harm than good coming from asking people about whether they've got a disability and a religion, and how does that come into play down the road. It sort of feels like their religious accommodation request was approved here, and now suddenly, if 6 months from now with full FDA approval, you're rethinking things, it feels like the switcheroo's been pulled. My view is if it's voluntary, it's voluntary, and I wouldn't get into the reasons other than, you know, beyond just pure declination. That's just me. But if it's a mandatory policy, then it's a different matter altogether. And we put together some paperwork that employers can use. A sample, I think, is on the next slide. You want to advance one, Aaron? This is one we just recently putting together, right? It's basically, there's different ways to do this. This is kind of the way I personally am liking it at the moment, but you can read it. If somebody's declining, if we got a voluntary policy, I think it's still, there's a benefit in having somebody sign off and acknowledge their declination. And it can be something as simple as this. This covers a little bit of the ground you want to cover here, right? It says, I understand that the employer is recommending I get COVID-19 vaccination. Okay, there's a bullet. My employer is encouraging it, they're recommending it, they're not making it mandatory. That gets signed off on. And it says, and the employers offered me the opportunity for vaccination at no cost. Okay, it's no cost to me. I get that. There's a value in sort of establishing that. I further understand the benefits of vaccination and the risks associated with COVID-19 and its variants. This is where I think you see some options. If you see some other people's declination forms, I've seen that people really get into it. Like, I understand the risk of horrible reactions and death and destruction from COVID-19. They really go into the parade of horribles, which is fine. But I didn't like it. I kind of just like it more minimally. I think there's a double-edged sword there. If you're really beating the drum about how horrible COVID vaccination, COVID is, and the need for vaccination, but not requiring it, it almost feels like an admission in there somewhere that can be used against you. So I sort of tamped that down a bit in this form. And then the rest of it you can read. It's, yep, but I'm declining vaccination. I understand that I might be required to take alternative measures. I understand that things might change. And it might become a condition of employment. So there's a little thing to weave in there as well that I like. But that's what documentation could look like in a sort of less than mandatory vaccination policy for folks who decline.
In the chat box, someone asked whether this declination, I think you led with this, but to repeat, whether this declination would be something an employer uses in a voluntary policy. And I know my position is it's kind of a little strange to have no requirements whatsoever. You get it or you don't get it, it's voluntary, but then you have an employee sign this declination. But I do think it's something that an employer will have to decide. What do you think, Pete?
Yes, let me see if I understand the question. So there's
voluntary.
If we have a voluntary program, what I said before is I don't like a very detailed request form that says, hey, it's a voluntary program, but here's why I'm not taking it, because it's medical, because it's religion, or because I just don't want it. I mean, that I think we can avoid, but in a voluntary program, for sure, you'd want a declination form. I mean, that's what this is mostly geared towards. You could also have it with a mandatory program, though. I mean, the declination form, we'll cover this in the next question, might be covered by the accommodation request form in a mandatory program. There's a different set of paperwork, but this thing you're looking at on the screen, I think the vision of it was really in a voluntary program. And again, to add a little more depth to it, the request form or the request to decline, I don't like being very detailed with reasons, medical, religion. Hey, it's voluntary, it's voluntary. That's just the way I look at it. Anyway, is that clear? I hope. There's no way to get feedback from the audience. I can't see nodding of heads or anything, but we do have a lot of questions in the chat, and we're going to probably have to follow up with some answers to some of these. We've been trying to answer them on the fly, but it's not even clear to me that everybody's getting all the answers. So we got a little maybe follow up to do after this, which is good. All right, next slide. All right, so what paperwork should we utilize to document exceptions to our vaccination policy? So this is maybe more geared towards the mandatory policy, right? That, hey, if somebody's making an accommodation request, how do we process that? How do we document that? Okay, it probably concludes with the declination form if the request is granted, but there may be a little more to say. And on the front end, we've developed a policy like this for the religious accommodation requests. Next slide. This is certainly not the only way to do it, but this is something that, we've used, and I think it works. So this is when an employee requests a religious accommodation, and this was for a healthcare provider with a mandatory program. You can see, I don't want to say the paces we've put the employee through, but that's kind of it. You're just kind of verifying that it's real and making sure that anybody who's really serious about this is in fact serious about this from the employee side. So it says, hey, here's my name, here's my date of request. Based on a sincerely held religious belief or practice, I object to vaccination. And here's why. Vaccination would conflict with my sincerely held religious belief or practice in the following ways. I don't know that people appreciate this, but it's okay to do this. And like I said, it at least gives us something to think about to make sure there is a sincerely held religious belief going on. Can't push back on it much. It's a low bar, but it's something. And then the next one is, hey, as an alternative to vaccination, I'm requesting the following. Well, it could just be a mask. It could be, I want to work from home. And well, who knows if that's reasonable or not, it all depends. And then the bottom part is just a little disclaimer like, hey, I understand this information is being requested just for purposes of verifying and understanding my request and to facilitate the accommodation discussion. I understand that HR might contact me and I might need to provide supporting documentation. And then there's a little declination language again. I further understand the benefits of vaccination and the risks. And there's a lot going on there in a quick form, but that's one way to deal with and document sort of the religious objector scenario, which is a pretty frequent one. And I suppose there could be a corollary on the disability side, but I didn't have a slide for that one. So that is kind of a bit on the paperwork side. Mark, Kathleen, got any thoughts on that?
I would just add that, I mean, with this request for religious accommodation one, I mean, that's what we talked about earlier, that you don't want to get too deep into questioning somebody's sincerely held religious beliefs, but this at least puts them on the spot to, kind of identify that it is actually a religious belief that that's the basis for their objection.
And on the medical side, you can ask for, backup from the doctors.
Okay, so we've got 6 minutes and about 6 questions left. So we're going to go warp speed on us here. Let's see. Next question. Should we require waivers releases? Okay, we get variants of this question. I guess there's 2 aspects to this, right? We're talking about, well, what about an employee suffering adverse effects from the vaccine? Should we get a release or waiver from the employee getting the vaccine? There's been cases of anaphylaxis, et cetera. So the risk of adverse reaction is low. There are some legal protections for the vaccine. If somebody did get an adverse reaction, it's probably a workers' comp claim. So I'm not that concerned about that aspect of waivers releases, just related to the vaccination. Maybe more interesting question is, well, what about employees refusing the vaccine, right? What if they then contract COVID? Are we exposed to some claim from them? What if customers contract COVID? Are we exposed to some claim from them? Can we deal with that liability via waivers and releases? Short answer is I think you can on the customer side. Early days of the vaccination, we saw this kind of stuff with gyms when they were still open, nursery schools. I mean, you'd want parents to have full knowledge of the risks of COVID, which were inescapable, and there's a value on the customer side of that. Technically, though, on the employee side, I don't think there's much legal value in trying to get a release from an employee of liability on the front end. There are laws on the books that are a little bit arcane and unknown, but that prohibit you from asking for employee waivers from negligence claims due to injury or illness at work. There's actually a law in the books that predates the workers' comp system, which really sort of undercuts the ability to get a negligence waiver from an employee. The idea of assumption of the risk, you almost want a document that says, you assume the risk, the risks, therefore, it's your fault if something bad happens. Well, there's actually a statute in the books that sort of eliminates the assumption of the risk defense in a negligence scenario. So for a lot of reasons, I think the release and waiver notion on the employee side is either unnecessary or unhelpful, but there's still a value in sort of communicating and it doesn't necessarily hurt in and of itself either, but I wouldn't view that on the employee side as a cure-all. We better move on to the next question just to keep this moving. Is it okay to offer a financial incentive for employees to get vaccinated? So this is coming up a lot. And boy, this is an interesting question too. Does everybody know what I'm thinking about here, which is, hey, we want to encourage people to get vaccinated. What if I give them $100? What if I give them two extra PTO days? And there's stuff going on this front too. Even leaving the law aside, there's considerations, right? Like, well, is this a good idea? You give people money to participate in clinical trials. It almost sounds like they're doing something experimental if you're giving them money to take the vaccine. It almost undercuts, some would argue, confidence in the vaccine. But there's another way of looking at it. A lot of companies are doing some sort of financial incentive. If you want to drill down into the law, here's the two problems with that. One is that, is it fair / legal for folks who have a disability exemption? Someone says, look, I've got a medical condition. I can't take your vaccine. The doctor says, I cannot take your vaccine. It's a medical risk to me because I'm always allergic to vaccines. And now you're getting everybody $200. I should get that too. I'm doing my job. I'm doing my accommodation alternatives. Why am I being deprived of $200? That's disability discrimination because of my medical condition. There's some validity to that. So you got to watch out for that. And if suddenly that undercuts your whole program, like, well, we got to give it to the people who don't get vaccinated too, well, query about the effectiveness of it. There's also this notion that's going on, it's been fought out in the last couple of years, is how much money can you really give somebody to sort of do something that would otherwise violate their rights under the ADA or GINA? I mean, if you're doing vaccination, you're giving medical information in the pre-screening front, maybe there's stuff like that going on. And so you saw this play out in wellness programs. Long and the short of it is the EEOC now has proposed regulations, not in effect yet, but the proposed regulations, if they go into effect, would say, hey, listen, it's okay to give somebody something de minimis as an incentive to go into your wellness program and give you all this medical information, or to get vaccinated and give you all this medical information, as long as it's de minimis. And they literally say, like a water bottle, So we'll see if the regulations go into effect. I don't see a lot of litigation over the employers who are giving $100, but in a 2-second conversation, I guess what I would prefer to see, to avoid the discrimination piece, to avoid the valuing of the thing, why not give PTO days? It kind of ties into some of the effects we expect to see from the vaccination anyway. So if you're going to give a financial incentive, strike the word financial, call it incentive, and maybe we deal with it with time off. And I think that's safer on all fronts. Next question. Is it okay to assign unvaccinated employees to different duties than vaccinated employees? Wow. I'm not sure we've got an answer to that one. I think that's a pure, it depends. We always say I went to law school for 3 years to learn that the answer is it depends. But in the right factual scenario, I could see that. I haven't seen it come across my desk yet, but it's possible that we're not firing somebody for not getting vaccinated, but there just may be a customer-facing role or dealing with immunocompromised patients that we just can't take that risk. And so they're not losing hours, they're not losing pay, but there may be job duties that they just can't do. Well, that may be defensible. Then again, spin the facts and it may not be defensible. Somebody doesn't get vaccinated and you say, well, it's a voluntary program, but if you don't get vaccinated, you're getting assigned to that basement office and you're going to be pushing paper all day. And, okay, now it sounds punitive. So I think the answer to that question really is, it depends. Happy to talk offline with people if they got particular concerns. I can't say that I've seen a lot on that front. Next question. If we allow unvaccinated employees to continue working, are we exposed to liability or if another employer or customer contracts COVID? Well, again, distinction, employees versus customers. I think employees coming down with COVID could be a workers' comp claim, at least if it's a hazard of the job in Massachusetts, sort of, again, healthcare. Customer, well, there have been lawsuits filed by customers who claim that they got exposed to COVID because of a failure to implement safety measures. I suppose, in theory, if we just say, look, we don't believe in vaccines in this company, nobody needs to get the vaccine, and it's a retail store and customers get exposed without knowing your policy on that, could that be a negligence type claim or public policy type claim? Yeah, I suppose so. Haven't seen it yet, but on the customer front, at least, that seems a legitimate concern. Next question. We're just about out of time here. I'm going to come up one short, I think. What are our legal obligations in connection with conducting the vaccination program? Good. I think we covered that. I think we covered that with all the ADA stuff and the confidentiality of medical records and the pre-screening questions and the documentation. That's what that all goes to. And in this one, we came up, like I said in the beginning, to kind of round out the top 10. We've gotten sort of the question, but not frequently. So here's the question. Is there any way to help our employees get to the front of the line for vaccination? Phrased that way, it sounds like a bad thing, and I think it would be. If you're tipping the scales in some, wrong, overly aggressive, unethical way, that would be bad. And we shouldn't be participating in that. But, to the extent we're entering phase 2 shortly in Massachusetts, and to the extent phase 2 covers grocery employees, restaurant employees, and the vaccinations are now going to be more readily available in more locations, I suppose employers roll out sort of a little form letter that says, hey, this is to confirm that so-and-so works for us and they work in this job category, which just so happens to fall into phase 2. Here you go. Here's our sort of stamp of approval on that. I suppose when you look at it that way, that's something that employers can and should be doing. But like I said, if it tips the scales, not a good idea. And the line issue, I know we're over time now. We started 2 minutes late, so we're actually on time. When I think of the line issue, I think of the PR problem of the leadership jumping the line, of the boss jumping the line. If everybody in the workforce is able to get the vaccine, but the boss goes first, if you do it right, it shows trust in the vaccine process, and it's a public-facing sort of demonstration of faith in the vaccination. If you do it wrong, it sounds like the bosses are abusing their position and jumping the line. So it's something to think about and be careful about. So that was a lot of information in an hour and a half. We really don't have time for Q&A at the end, but we've got a lot of questions in the chat. To the extent we haven't been able to answer them in the program, we'll take a look and see if we can develop some themes and do some follow-up, because I know this is real important, cutting edge stuff. There we are. The last thing is for more on this, Mark and Kathleen and I were invited by HRW partner John Graff to participate, a couple of weeks ago in a wonderful podcast that John does called Higher Ground. And if anybody wants to hear that, it's available on Apple, Spotify, but it's called Higher Ground. And it's a great podcast, and John does a great job with that. And we were, the three of us, very happy to participate. And then the last slide is contact information. And that's it. Only 3 minutes overtime. So appreciate everybody's attendance and participation. Like I said, we'll follow up tomorrow with slide deck and with handouts and with maybe some answers to some of these unanswered questions.
Thanks, everyone.